trusted, timely, global insights. Data is everywhere and easy to find. Data that delivers insights for business decisions is rare. IDC's Global Data Science Analyst team ensures you have the data you need for assessing the market, creating opportunities, and driving growth. IT marketing and sales professionals must be able to accurately assess the current competitive landscape. Are we keeping up with market leaders? How do we differentiate ourselves and build our brand? Where do we rank against the competition? IDC Tracker provides answers to these questions with accurate and timely data on market size, vendor share, and forecasts for hundreds of technology markets around the globe. IDC delivers tracker data for over 100 countries, offering unparalleled local and global insights for data-driven decisions. IDC Tracker data helps your company save time, money, and resources with essential competitive information to benchmark performance and market share, refine product features, set growth and sales targets, develop analytical models, create Marcom and channel strategies, and find growth opportunities. Our exclusive North American tracker, powered by the Global Technology Distribution Council, provides the only complete view of what is happening in the IT distribution channel with technology, vendors, and end users. By combining local analyst insights with a global technology view, IDC Tracker provides the data and analytics our clients rely on to make strategic business decisions every day. Improve your market intelligence, strategy and planning, product marketing, sales, and channel partnerships. Through these use cases and more, IDC's data and analytics products deliver a complete toolkit that organizations around the world rely on to support and achieve their business goals. IDC Data and Analytics Solutions, the confidence in knowing.
Welcome and hello everyone to this third Tech Talk Live session that I'm hosting. If you've been following me, you would have noticed that I bring in experts from IDC's different domains to talk about the story behind the data that we were just talking about in the video. And it's important to draw insights, to talk about things that are not so evident in the charts and numbers when you have discussions with some of these experts. Today, I bring in Bryan, who is our leader for devices research in Asia Pacific Japan region. And with him, I'd like to talk more about what's going on in the devices market today. Bryan, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Avneesh.
And the question I have right at the beginning is, when I'm looking at IT spending and I see how the trend of the curve is changing, one of the big things in 2023 was the market came down quite a lot, and it was primarily driven by PCs. The enterprise funding and cloud and AI and analytics continues to, stay relatively stronger. But PCs came down, and I think some of the talk out there, the narrative was that post-pandemic, people aren't working from home, etc., and so that's that. So what's going to happen now and in the coming times, and when do we see the curve changing?
Yeah, that's definitely the big question, especially given what a roller coaster ride the PC market has been on over the past few years. And as you can see in this chart here, I've plotted global PC shipments by consumer and commercial, along with their growth rates right there, both pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and our forecasted years going out here. And as you can see, obviously the PC market did quite well during the pandemic, especially as people had to work from home and study from home and even entertain at home. But obviously, as you can see, as we look at this year in 2023, it's a pretty soft market, 252 million units. That's a 14% decline from last year. And if you compare it to 2019 volumes at 268 million, it's actually below pre-pandemic levels. So this is a market that has been struggling quite a bit, or has come down quite a bit over the past year. There's been a number of issues facing the market, obviously, most obviously from the post-pandemic behavior. Not as many people need devices to be when they're not at home anymore, as they've returned to office and so forth, or at least they bought their devices already over the past couple of years. But also we have a lot of macroeconomic pressures in the market right now, right? Between inflation, exchange rates, just general uncertainty around, whether or not people are even going to have a job in the next 6 months. That obviously impacts the consumer side. And on the commercial side, IT departments who maybe their hiring plans were not as ambitious as they originally had, or maybe for worse, maybe they're even laying off people. They don't need as many PCs as they used to. So there's been a lot of adjustments happening there. And even though we've seen a lot of PC vendors, fortunately, been able to clear a lot of their inventory over the past 6 months in the first half of this year, there's still some questions on when we see a recovery, right? And as you can see in this chart here, we do expect a mild recovery going into next year, about 4% growth. We pared it back a little bit from where we were 3 months ago, down from 6% previously, but nonetheless, it's a mild growth. And if you kind of eyeball the chart here, the light blue for consumer is still a little soft. It's not great, but the dark blue in commercial is where you see a little bit of activity. It's not huge. Maybe it's a little more obvious if you look at the growth rate lines with the green versus the purple, consumer versus commercial. The commercial side's a little stronger, but at the end of the day, we are talking about single-digit growth rates. So let's not get too carried away here. It is a case where that commercial, nonetheless, there is a little bit of a recovery there.
So maybe some of this commercial demand is also driven by people coming back to office and companies having to go and refresh or maybe follow up on some pent-up demand that's coming through. And that's why we see that warm a little more optimistic than the purple one. Is that probably the thing that you're seeing here?
To some degree. I wouldn't say it's pent-up demand, but what we do expect to see in the upcoming year is some replacement demand. Particularly as you look at devices that were purchased during the pandemic, particularly on the commercial side, right? Roughly a 3-year lifespan, at the very least, 3-year lifespan on those PCs basically brings us into the replacement cycle in the upcoming years. Now, obviously, it's not going to be as pronounced just yet, but there are other drivers here that we are looking at that can help the commercial sector as well. From an OS supplier side, we are looking at Windows 10 end of life approaching in 2025. That'll help spur a little bit of activity. But again, relatively minor growth rates that you can see that we're putting here. I think the other thing, though, that I think the industry is really quite hopeful for and has been talking up is AI, and specifically the idea of an AI PC potentially helping to drive this market. I mean, I guess we're all in the tech sector, right? We hear how much about all this hype around AI, which may be a little overhyped, but all this hype around AI, and granted, most of that's in the data center and in other areas, but now there's discussion about AI on the PC, locally on the PC. So that's a case where, again, we're talking about local AI accelerators on the PC. So rather than running these models in the data center like we generally do today with AI, now we're talking about bringing those models locally to the device. Brings the advantage of privacy, brings the advantage of speed, because you're not waiting to go all the way out to the network and come back, and also potentially cost, if the cost of running the inference locally is cheaper than it is running in the data center. So there's some interesting activity there, and certainly folks like Intel and AMD, they're talking up how this is going to be a great thing for the PC industry and how it could potentially be an inflection point for the industry, especially as IT departments look at, I can save employee time by automatically summarize, by having things like Windows Copilot automatically summarizing meeting notes or digesting that 50-page report into a few bullet points or helping to write a report, right? In theory, it sounds like it's great. It's going to save a lot of employee time. But as you can see in this chart here, we are not factoring in any major change in the forecast yet. While I do agree, directionally speaking, that it is a good thing for the industry and it can eventually help the industry, I think there are still some challenges before we get there. It's going to take a while before we get there. We still have to bring those models that we've trained in the data center and compact them down to the local device. We still need to get more hands-on time with some of these use cases. Microsoft's talked about them conceptually, but not a whole lot of people have had a lot of hands-on time with these models. And so it's a little hard to quantify confidently how much that ROI is going to be. And yet our US team has done surveys of IT decision makers where we asked them, how much more are they willing to pay for an AI PC? And interestingly, we got some really optimistic results, right? Some of them said they'd be willing to pay $75 more for an AI-enabled PC. So there's some optimism there that can help drive this market, but I'm still a bit hesitant on how much this is really going to really affect the market. And that's also why when we look at the forecast here, we are looking at still a relatively tame single-digit forecast. Even if AI can be an accelerator for the market, it could take a little time before we get there.
So, of course, you're saying you're going to wait and watch this, and you're probably going to see some use cases come through. But I'll tell you, from November to June, the kind of interest and intentions that have changed on ChatGPT are short signs that people are actually thinking about, enterprises are thinking of investing more. I think what you're saying is once the use cases are a bit more evident, then it's a little clearer for them to draw that path and say, well, this is where we go, and this is exactly where we're going to empower people with a lot of these devices. I understand. Thanks, Bryan, for that narrative. Now, since we're at the back of Apple's launches, tell me a little about Apple and PC. Have they been able to make any big inroads into the commercial side, especially? We know they enjoy a good standing in the consumer and education side. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, exactly. Just like you said, they're obviously more skewed towards the consumer and a little bit to education, and not so much on the enterprise side, where of course IT departments depend on Windows in most cases. However, what is interesting to look at is some pockets of activity where some IT departments, particularly the more progressive ones, have been more open to giving their employees MacBooks. Such that in some specific cases, I think Cisco is one of the examples where apparently when employees at Cisco either join or are up for a replacement of their PCs and they get a choice of the PC they want, up to half of them choose a Mac, which is quite interesting, especially if there is an increasing perception that Macs create fewer help desk tickets than Windows-based users as well too. So far the numbers for Macs in enterprise are still relatively small. I mean, at the end of the day, there's still so much of a driving force and inertia behind the Windows ecosystem, and obviously IT departments, if they ain't broken, don't fix it, right? So there's still a lot of Windows momentum, but it's interesting to see there's an increasing encroachment of Mac in the enterprise, where even some businesses even use it as a recruiting tool for fresh grads to say, hey, come work for me. I'm going to give you a MacBook. Don't get that boring other computer. I'm going to give you a Mac instead. So there's a little bit of momentum in this direction. Although, yes, like you said, Avneesh, the bulk of the units for Apple are still very much consumer and, again, a little bit of education.
Thanks. I'm going to shift gears now and go from one screen to the other. Let's talk about smartphones and tell me a little more about what's ailing that market and that industry. We've also seen saturation in demand in smartphones lately, and maybe it's related to China. Maybe it's related to the world economic issues that we are facing. But maybe you have something more than that to tell us and the viewers today. Go ahead and talk us through that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just like you said, smartphones have gone through a number of issues, including what you mentioned between economic pressures, which have, by the way, hurt developing markets in particular, when individuals in developing markets are more concerned about putting food on the table rather than buying their next smartphone. We've also had situations where there's just saturation, right? People who have smartphones already don't necessarily need to replace them yet. They're holding on to their phones longer than they were before. It used to be like a 2-year lifespan, now becoming 3 and even 4 years, where, that batteries are good enough, cameras in many cases are good enough, where people don't feel as compelled to buy that latest and greatest phone anymore. And so the market has really softened quite a bit. You can see here in this chart, you got some similar trends to what you saw in PCs, but more muted. Obviously, the pandemic didn't have as much of a driving effect, and we're far below pre-pandemic levels now as we look in 2023, which we still expect to contract 5%. In fact, we softened that forecast a little bit from where we were 3 months ago, which was at -3%. Now we're at -5%. So this is a market that is relatively soft. There haven't been as many demand drivers, and similar to PCs, there was also a lot of inventory inventory that was built up on the OEM side. Fortunately, a lot of that has been cleared, but many of the OEMs are hesitant to place orders right now because they don't see that demand. And also, Avneesh, you mentioned China. Yeah, the fact that China's economy is struggling right now, the fact that the post-lockdown lifting hasn't quite materialized into consumer demand, at least for devices, is also a factor in this as well. So 2023 is a market that is expected to be relatively soft. But we do at least hope that there will be some mild recovery, as you can see in the 2024 bar. And that purple line there for the growth, single-digit growth rates. It's still not back to the 1.4 billion units a year that we were at previously. We are now in a new era of a 1.2 billion unit a year market for smartphones.
Totally. There's so much talk about these foldables that are coming through, and there's renewed interest, and especially in certain age brackets, to get more of those. That should be driving some demand here. And then there's iPhone 15 that we just heard about. Talk us about these two trends and what's going on.
Sure. So let's take foldables first. Foldables, I guess, is one of the few bright spots in the industry, right? Or at least I should say, with most phones, many of them all taking that same shape, and everybody just talking about better cameras and that kind of thing. At least there's a little more excitement around foldables. This is because it's like, ooh, new cool shiny thing that folds and flips and all that kind of thing. And obviously Samsung is playing a big role in this, right? A lot of these numbers that you see here, a lot of the share is Samsung's share. There's also a number of Chinese vendors, but the bulk of the global share is Samsung's. And you can see that we do expect some growth moving ahead. Now, we do need to keep in mind that despite this growth, the reality is that this is still a small part of the market, right? Last year, 14 million foldables shipped. When you compare that to the total market size of 1.2 billion, it's only about 1.2% of the total market. And even though we expect foldables to continue to grow, especially as those average selling prices come down in the purple and green lines, that 2027 figure of 50 some odd million units of foldables, again, out of that total percentage, or as a percentage of the total smartphone market, is still just over 4% of the total smartphone market. So it's still not mass market yet, but yes, at least it's a little bit of excitement. And yeah, by the way, in case you're wondering how I split the small versus large foldables here, basically it's like, the small foldables is like the Galaxy Flip. So it's kind of cute, appeals to a fashion-centric user who maybe likes to prop up the phone and be able to do TikTok videos, record TikTok videos easily and that kind of thing, as opposed to the large ones, which unfold into more of a tablet-sized device, tends to appeal more towards professionals, wealthier users that want that large screen. So anyway, point is regardless of the design type, there's obviously still a lot of activity happening here. There's also still room for improvement, frankly, around things like the hinge and the durability and the crease, as well as the applications and the use case. So there's some things that the industry is working through, but nonetheless, this is something that at least is brings a different light to the picture that we had previously, which is relatively down. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is, of course, the Apple iPhone 15, which just launched this past week. And obviously Apple has continued to innovate in things like the camera with the periscope lens on the Pro Max, the titanium frame, which incidentally, a lot of people are saying is, ooh, it's a much lighter device now. Maybe that'll compel them to upgrade, as well as, of course, USB-C and other things that they've built into the device. So Apple should still continue to do well with that. Now, granted, we do need to keep in mind that this is a down market, right? So you remember that slide previously, minus 5% that we're looking at this year. We expect Apple to actually close out the year relatively flat or slightly up even. So even if it's not big growth rates for Apple, it's still better than the rest of the market. So, and by the way, the premium part of the market is actually still doing quite well, or at least I should say it's more resilient. It's not completely immune to this downturn, but at least it's doing better than the low end of the market. I talked about those emerging markets earlier and how there are difficult decisions being made around what they should be spending their money on. Well, at least the premium part of the market, and particularly iPhone users, iPhone fans, Apple fans, I should say, who are quite fanatic about the brand, at least there's a bit of resilience there that'll keep that going.
I have to ask you this question because it's hanging as a cloud on top of Apple, and that is the whole China government policy of restricting Apple use within the Chinese government employees. Is that going to have a major impact on Apple as we speak about the next year and the years ahead?
It does, but also the other factor, of course, is Huawei quietly releasing their new phone, and that's gotten even more attention, I would argue. I think that's actually the bigger threat than the public sector employees. But we've worked out a number of models, and there's a range that you could use here depending on whether we count. Sorry, I should separate the two. The public sector employees and then Huawei. I think, like I said, Huawei is going to be the bigger factor. For the government sector employees, you could, depending on your model, the impact could be, let's say 1 or 2 million units. That's out of Apple's total shipments in China of about 50 million units a year. Okay. Right? So that helps to give you a percentage idea of what the impact is. The Huawei side could actually be even bigger than that. They're getting a lot of attention, especially since when you look at the premium part of the China smartphone market, it basically came down to being able to choose between Apple versus Huawei. And given that Huawei prior to this was short on supply, they could only get 4G chips due to the trade sanctions or the trade restrictions. Basically, Apple was doing quite well in China because there was no Huawei. Now that Huawei's got some supply back, some consumers, very patriotic consumers, will opt for Huawei devices. And so that could potentially put a bigger dent on Apple in China. Now, there's a limit to how much that can be because again, this is they're producing silicon using older generation fabrication technology, which has lower yields, higher costs, and that means inherently there's going to be a cap to how much Huawei can produce. It could be anywhere between a range of 5 to 10 million units a year. So that again puts a perspective on that 50 million that Apple does every year, about 5 or 10 million of that potentially being impacted by Huawei, and another maybe 1-2 million coming from the public sector stuff that you talked about earlier, Avneesh.
See. So all in all, you're saying it's not that a big a deal in terms of what that impact is made out to be, what it could be, and short term at least. And we'll see how Huawei, comes back once they have the scale, as you said, and that could be the real or bigger threat.
Well, and I think, in the China landscape, there will be a bigger impact, obviously. But from a global perspective, if you're looking at, less than 10 million unit impact, Apple moves 230 million units a year. So then it's a smaller impact from that perspective.
Excellent. Thanks. And that was, again, a great narrative of what's going on in the phones market. Let's again switch gears, Bryan, and let's talk about the virtual world now. I know that you lead AR/VR research for the region as well. And I want to know, there was so much promise that augmented reality, virtual reality had. We have seen a slew of devices and gadgets come through. And unfortunately, we haven't really seen any big numbers, and they haven't sustained themselves from what I've seen so far. But let's hear from you. What's going on in that market? What are some of the use cases that you're seeing brighter than others? And how do you see the outlook as we go forward?
Sure. So yeah, the AR/VR market's been struggling, as you pointed out. It's been around for almost a decade now. And yet, as you can see in this chart on the left, it's very small compared to these other markets, right? AR/VR headsets is about a 10 million unit a year market. You compare that to many of these more established product categories in the green, and it's much, much smaller. This is one that is it's been facing a lot of challenges, everything from the hardware to the content to, even just society accepting everyone wearing these clunky looking headsets. It just looks weird, right, when people are wearing them. So it still faces a lot of challenges. So if we take a look then at the forecast that I have here on the right in blue, if we can advance the slide to the part in the blue on the right, there we go. Thanks. This shows our outlook for the market where, there's a little bump in 2021 and 2020. There was a chip shortage, don't forget. And then finally Oculus or Facebook, right, which is the bulk of these units. They got some of their supplies back in 21, but like I said, it's still about a 10 million unit a year market. Now, as we go forward, you do expect to see some growth there. Some of that is coming from Facebook and Oculus. They're launching new products next month. Some of it is coming from Sony, who recently launched their PlayStation VR. And of course, that attaches to gaming consoles, right? Some of it also comes from Apple. Now, that's actually a small part of it. We do think that Apple has some supply constraints around the screen. Obviously, that $3,500 price tag is a big issue for them as well, too. But nonetheless, this is a case of more vendors that will help to drive the market. And frankly, Apple is a much needed catalyst for the industry. I think the industry has really been waiting for Apple to get in the game because they obviously help drive a lot of developers and the ecosystem. They also have that cool factor, right? That awkwardness that I mentioned with these weird glasses. If anyone can make it cool, Apple can make it cool, right? And so there's a little bit of that excitement that's moving in that direction as well, too. And plus, of course, Apple, if you've seen the demo or the launch that they did of the Vision Pro, they've actually done a pretty good job of that user experience, the latency, the hand gestures and all that. But again, it's a $3,500 product. So that is not a mass market price. And hence, in this forecast, it's still not the thing that brings this market to 100 million units, right? We're still keeping it in the 10 to 20 million unit range, but at least it's something that, with a longer term picture, is something that we do expect to drive more units and hopefully get us beyond just the gaming and video use cases that we currently have today.
Thank you very much, Bryan. This was a great journey for us to go from devices to smartphones and finally on AR, VR. I'm hoping our viewers got a good return on their time spending the last 30 minutes with us and, transcending through these three different worlds. Do let us know if you have any questions or comments. You have Bryan, Ma, and me. You can always call us back. And please do give us feedback if you want to contact us and give us feedback on this presentation or the discussion that we had, as well as anything that you want us to follow up on as far as the content is concerned. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.